Listo, profesor.
Gracias. Le encargo también la admisión de cualquier otra persona que vaya a entrar acá a la sala. Muy bien. Es con gran placer que damos la bienvenida esta mañana al profesor Johannes Preiser-Kapeller de la Universidad de Viena y del Centro de Investigaciones de Austria, de la Academia Científica de Austria. El profesor Johannes Kapeller ha aceptado muy amablemente nuestra invitación. Se trata de un experto a nivel mundial en historia global del mundo premoderno. Específicamente, el doctor Preiser-Kapeller se ha especializado en el mundo bizantino, pero siempre se ha concentrado igualmente en los estudios del occidente medieval, del norte de África, del Islam y de China, en una perspectiva de historia global. Actualmente es investigador del Instituto de Investigaciones en Estudios Medievales de la Academia Austriaca de las Ciencias. Es también profesor en la Universidad de Viena y ha sido también investigador en el Römisch-Germanisches Zentralmuseum de Mainz en Alemania. Además ha sido profesor visitante en las universidades de Bucarest en Rumania, Tübingen en Alemania, la Central European University de Budapest, la Universidad de Mainz en Alemania y universidades de Creta y Atenas en Grecia y también en la Universidad de Tokio en Japón. Se concentra en el análisis del mundo premoderno con la utilización de sistemas complejos. Esto implica el análisis y la construcción de modelos matemáticos que implican múltiples variables, entre las cuales se encuentra el clima, la demografía, las redes sociales, la economía y la comunicación. Y en relación con las últimas tres, lo que es la movilidad, circulación de personas y de bienes. Profesor Kapeller, esta conferencia será en inglés y luego las preguntas serán transmitidas en inglés y en español. Estamos en este momento transmitiendo igualmente en YouTube, donde pueden también hacer sus comentarios y preguntas. Professor Preiser-Kapeller, welcome to the National University of Costa Rica, to the Maestría en Historia Aplicada. It is really a pleasure to have you here, and we are eager to listen to your conference and your talk today.
Thank you very much for this invitation. It's also a great pleasure and honor to receive this invitation, and good morning to everyone. I guess it's for most of you it's good morning, and I'm sorry that I'm not able to give this lecture in Spanish. Unfortunately, I can only read Spanish texts, but I'm not able to talk in this language, and I hope that it will be possible to communicate my main points also in English. So I will now share my screen so that you can see the presentation, and I hope that this will work and that you can see my slides. Okay, so in my today's talk, I will focus on two macro regions of Afro-Eurasia, the one in the west around the Eastern Mediterranean, with a focus on the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt and the adjacent regions, and the Byzantine Empire around the Aegean, and on East Asia with a focus of the Chinese Empire of the Song dynasty. And in my talk, I will try to contrast some scenarios which have been established in recent research regarding the interplay or the impact of climatic change on the history of these regions, with some also methodological considerations of how we should deal with the interplay between climatic fluctuations, socio-political dynamics and migration in both of these regions. And this will also be the main point of my talk, that we should be very careful if we combine these various types of data in order to draw a more complex image of what is ongoing in the interplay between environment and human societies. So if we start in Western Eurasia, at the beginning of the 11th century, this region between the Eastern Mediterranean and Central Asia was dominated by several large-scale polities, such as the already mentioned Fatimid Shiite Islamic Caliphate centered onto Egypt, and the Byzantine, or as they called themselves, Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, around the Aegean in southeastern Europe and modern-day Turkey. And also, especially in Central Asia and Iran, the Ghaznavid Empire, established by a Turkish dynasty in the late 10th century. If we look at this map, however, some 60 years later, it has profoundly changed. The previously dominating polities have been reduced to to smaller scales, such as the Fatimid Empire now only ruling over Egypt, Byzantium having lost the control over Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, the Ghaznavids reduced to their domains in modern-day Afghanistan and northern India, while a new big player had established itself in the area from Central Asia all the way to the Mediterranean, the Great Seljuk Empire, established by a group of Turkish nomad tribes under the dynasty of the Seljuks, who had defeated all the three empires which had dominated the region before. And this geopolitical change has been linked with climatic changes in a book of 2012 by the Israeli historian Ronnie Ellenblum, entitled The Collapse of the Eastern Mediterranean. And this title is already a program because Ellenblum argued that this change more or less marked as a dramatic hiatus, a dramatic change in the history of this entire region, similar to the fall of the Western Roman Empire and its implication for Western European history. So that this was a change at the same scale, and that it was, like also in recent books has been argued for the fate of Rome, as in this book of Karl Harper of 2017, that it was primarily driven by climatic change. So this was the argument of Ronnie Ellenblum, who also argued that this was a combination of calamities in the sedentary empires, which were affected by climatic changes, droughts, the fall of harvests, so in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Byzantium, and at the same time also especially cold climate conditions motivated nomadic groups to migrate towards these regions, which eventually then led to the establishment of the Seljuk domain and the downfall of the already established, previously dominating empires. So this is the scenario Ellenblum tries to create in this book, which had found quite some attention. And if one looks at the paleo-environmental data, at the first glance, this seems to be a possible scenario, because actually not only for the Eastern Mediterranean, but for many regions across Afro-Eurasia, we observe in several decades of the 11th century an increased frequency of extreme weather events. And these extreme weather events can be connected to a large extent to the so-called Ort minimum, which is a period of reduced solar activity in the 11th century. The term minimum relates to the minimum in the number of sunspots. So if the sun is in a period of high activity, more sunspots appear on its surface and can be observed. And in periods where there is a smaller number of sunspots, so almost no sunspots can be observed, a minimum of sunspots. These are periods of decreased solar activity and also periods where on the average global temperatures decrease. And several such minima have been identified for the last millennia, and the one in the 11th century is named after the Dutch astronomer Jan Hendrik Oort. This reduction of solar activity not only led to a reduction on average global temperatures, but also affected various oscillations, climatic oscillations, which at large have impact on the climatic conditions in Western Eurasia. One is active until today and quite prominent between a high pressure system in the Central Atlantic and a low pressure system in the Northern Atlantic around Iceland, the so-called North Atlantic oscillation. And if the difference between these pressure systems is very strong, this normally contributes to relatively warm and mild climatic conditions in Western and Central Europe, but to rather dry and arid conditions in the Mediterranean. And such predominantly positive climatic effects for Western and Central Europe can be observed throughout some periods of what has been called the medieval climate anomaly between the 10th and the 13th century. If on the contrast, the difference between these pressure systems is relatively small, this normally leads to relatively cool and dry conditions in Western and Central Europe and more humid, wetter conditions in the Mediterranean. And this was the case throughout some periods of what is called the Little Ice Age between the 14th and the 19th century, but also during some of the decades of the 11th century. This would at a first glance indicate that this would have been positive conditions for the Mediterranean, which otherwise is often affected by more arid conditions. However, also additional oscillations are at play, which then contributed to a series of extreme events in the Eastern Mediterranean, as the oscillation between a high pressure system over the North Sea and a low pressure system over the Caspian Sea, the North Sea Caspian pattern, which in a specific constellation blocks, but in another constellation allows for the inflow of very cold air masses to the Eastern Mediterranean, especially during the winter months. And such a pattern could be observed for the last time in the winter of 2022, from which these images stem. And you see there was not only snow in Istanbul in Turkey, but also in Athens in Greece, and even on the islands of the Aegean. And we have descriptions of similar extreme cold events in the 11th century, also in other regions of the Eastern Mediterranean, and even in Iraq and all the way to Egypt. Egypt, finally, and especially the River Nile, the main source of irrigation of Egypt, is very much connected to the monsoon precipitation systems over the Indian Oceans, which affect the precipitation conditions in the areas where the Nile originates. And these precipitation conditions are in turn connected to an oscillation pattern, which I guess is quite well known also in Costa Rica, the El Niño Southern Oscillation, which has its name because this weather phenomenon often occurs around Christmas and is defined as the difference between surface temperatures around modern-day Indonesia and the waters off the coast of North and South America. And as you can see, El Niño can affect precipitation conditions globally from the Americas all the way to East Africa, where the River Nile originates. And the same is true for La Niña, the counterpart of El Niño, which also affects Eastern African precipitation conditions. And we also see various occurrences of El Niño and La Niña events in the 11th century affecting the River Nile. In addition to these longer-term variations, we also have short-term climatic anomalies, which can be caused by volcanic eruptions. The large masses of aerosols ejected in the atmosphere can not only contribute to a cooling of surface temperatures for 1, 2, 3 years, but also to an increase of other extreme weather events, so also droughts or extreme rainfall events. All these can be connected to climate anomalies caused by volcanic eruptions. And we have a series of such volcanic eruptions also in the 10th and also up to the early 11th century, and again, and also in the early 12th century, where also recent studies have indicated the impact of these anomalies on weather patterns across Afro-Eurasia. Where does this information come from? Just a short overview. On the one hand, we have what the Swiss pioneer of climate history, Christian Pfister, has called the archives of nature. These are natural phenomena whose qualitative and quantitative composition correlates with various climatic factors, as you can see in this overview. And we have an increasing number of such data. So this is the biggest amount of new data we get every year in the field of paleo-environmental history. And you see an overview. These are some of these what is called proxy data sites for the Eastern Mediterranean. And you see there's quite a big amount of them, and this is increasing really year by year. And we have also an increasing amount of such data for East and Central Asia, as you can see in the map on the right. Maybe one type of these archives of nature, which is very easy to understand, are tree rings. So the strength of a tree ring is indicating the growth of a tree within the vegetation period of a specific year. Of course, very much depends on the weather condition during this vegetation period, especially precipitation and temperature. And in paleoenvironmental studies, these tree rings, an increasing number of tree rings, now can be used to reconstruct precipitation and temperature conditions across wider regions for centuries and millennia back. So the longest tree ring series, for instance, we have for Central Europe now ranges all the way back to the end of the last maximum ice age, 12,000 years before our period. The counterpart to these archives of nature are the archives of society. So this is the material normally we as historians work with. So written sources, observations by contemporaries, historiographies. And you see an overview here. And you will also get a link where you can download all these slides so that you can then have a look at them also in a less dense version as in my talk now. And ideally, we also have such observations, which are also measurements of natural phenomena. And one example, which is really one of the best archives we have with regarding to paleo-environmental conditions, are measurements of the Nile flood. The Nile flood being the main source of irrigation for Egypt since millennia. And from the 7th century CE onwards, we have a continuous data set, especially stemming from one of these nilometers, these devices to measure the increase of the Nile flood between the late summer and the early spring. And this is the nilometer on the island of Rhoda near Cairo. And you see to the right here a depiction of this nilometer, which exists until today. And for this nilometer, we have a time series for the last 1,400 years. And of course, also covering the 11th century. And now if we return to the 11th century, what we can observe is in the late 10th and in the 11th century, several clusters of years of very low Nile floods. So not only for 1 year, but up to 7 years, the Nile flood was not sufficient to irrigate most of the agricultural land to the left and to the right of the river Nile. One of the longest clusters of this kind occurred in the late 960s. And contributed to the destabilization of the regime in Egypt then, and allowed for the invasion of Egypt by the Fatimids. The Fatimids were a Shiite Islamic dynasty in modern-day Tunisia, and they had established themselves at the beginning of the 10th century, and from there, their army invaded Egypt and conquered Egypt. And one of the first measures of the general of this army was to regulate the grain market in the capital of Egypt, which was Al-Fustat at that time. And via this, by providing an additional inflow of grain to the market, of course, also the new regime was legitimized. So this was also an act of legitimation of the new regime after the conquest of Egypt. However, the Fatimids then complicated the supply network of the capital by adding to the original capital of Al-Fustat a new palace city, Al-Qahira, in modern day terms, Cairo, which was established originally as a separate palace city to the north of Al-Fustat. And this, however, led to often a competition between the urban metabolisms of Cairo and the older metropolis of Al-Fustat. So the ruler in Al-Qahira was able to block supplies coming from the north of Egypt, while the inhabitants of Al-Fustat sometimes did the same with supplies coming from the south. And this especially occurred during times of harvest failures. And in the long term, what we also read in the descriptions of contemporaries is that the water of the river Nile, of course, was polluted by the wastewaters of Al-Fustat, so that the inhabitants of Cairo often had to drink the polluted water which flowed down the Nile. So here we have various aspects of this competition of the supply of these two originally separate cities. And of course, this competition in the supply of these two cities became a severe problem if there were not sufficient supplies, if there was a harvest failure in periods of insufficient Nile floods. We have relatively detailed data which indicates that the bread price, the price for grain, rose up to 10 times of the normal price. And for instance, also for a crisis in the 1050s, we read that at that time there were only sufficient supplies for the palace city, for Cairo, while the inhabitants of Al-Fustat had to suffer from famine. And of course, this led then to social upheavals and also rebellions. The peak of this crisis we observed in the period between 1064 and 1074, which has been called in the historiography of the Fatimid Empire the Great Calamity. And it is connected to a series of very low Nile floods in the late 1060s, and is one of the main showcases of the hypothesis of Ronnie Ellenblum in this book, which I've mentioned, that primarily climate conditions were responsible for the crisis of these polities. However, if we read in detail the sources describing this crisis, it becomes clear that the failure of the Nile is one important factor, but it is one factor among many, as we see in this text where it is mentioned in the 5th position after other factors, socio-political factors, political stability. And it also is also clear that even then in the years when the Nile flood was sufficient again, due to the lack of security, the land was not cultivated. So even in the absence of climatic factors, other socio-economic factors, social political insecurity contributed to the lack of harvest and to famine. At the end of this period, the regime was stabilized again in a similar way as it has originally been established. Another general then found his way to Egypt, Badr al-Jamali, and he, in the service now of the Fatimid Caliph, again regulated the grain market with very severe measures. Some of the grain merchants were even killed, as we read in this passage. And again, via this, another regime, a new phases of the regime was legitimized. And at the same time, however, the Fatimids then lost the territories outside of Egypt. So the regime in the end was stabilized, but they lost the provinces beyond the core in Egypt. I think what we can see from this first case study is that the historical dynamics are more complex than what has been suggested by Ronnie Ellenblum in this book of 2012. We have to be aware that, of course, climate and natural factors play a role, and there's the sheer physical magnitude of such an event as the failure of the Nile flood. However, disasters have to be understood as hybrid socio-natural events, because disasters have a social context. Human actions can affect the intensity and frequency of disaster. And this is also what I will try to show in the two other showcases in the next minutes. This can also be connected to a specific group of theories which have been developed by the Indian Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen with regard to hunger or famine. Why there is hunger? Of course, there can be a lack of foodstuff due to the failure of harvest. However, what Amartya Sen made clear, it is also about the distribution of entitlement to food. So what is left in such a situation is normally unequally distributed according to socio-economic status of the population or even of settlements. We see then in the case of Al-Fustat and Cairo that the resident city of the Caliph, of course, has primarily access to what food is left in such a crisis, while the majority of the population in Al-Fustat had to suffer, while by a different distribution of food may have avoided the famine in the big metropolis. So these are questions of socio-economic distribution of power and wealth, which are decisive for the outcome of what in the originally is a natural phenomena, like a failure of the Nile flood. So we have to be aware of these different dimensions of this crisis and the correlation with the unequal distribution of risks within a society due to unequal vulnerabilities and buffer options. So the access, for instance, to remaining provisions, the remaining supplies of grain, and also the share and the decision-making on the distribution of the remaining supplies. These are the decisive questions which will then determine the outcome of such a physical or natural impact on a society. And the same is true for migration. Also, migration is beyond simple push and pull factors. It's not only that maybe natural resources are exhausted in a specific region, or there's a drought or a famine, and in another region there is no famine. The migration is depending on very complex decision making, also at the level of individual households. And in the aggregation, they then may affect a mass migration from one region to another. But that's not a simple push-pull scenario as we often find in such studies. One example, again, connected to the Fatimid crisis, which is also often cited as a case of a migration affected by climate change, is the migration of the nomadic tribe of the Banu Hilal, who in the mid-1040s migrated from Egypt via Libya to modern-day Tunisia, and there destroyed a lot of the irrigation infrastructure there. And in a paper, quite recent paper of 2017, Matt King argued that this was also caused by a severe drought. And he reconstructed this drought on the basis of one type of paleoclimatic archive, which are tree rings. And this is a tree-ring reconstruction for the entire Mediterranean and Europe called the Old World Drought Atlas, which is also accessible online. And for the years of the migration of the Banu Hilal, this reconstruction actually shows dry conditions in North Africa. However, one has to be aware that, first of all, this is only one archive and we have no comparable descriptions in written sources. And secondly, the explanatory power of this Old World Drought Atlas for this region in this period is very weak, because as you see in the map at the bottom, there is no data set for Tunisia itself. The next data sets are quite distant in modern day mid-Algeria. And these data sets are also very few. Normally, you would need dozens of these data points to have a reliable reconstruction. So the reconstruction of the Old World Drought Atlas is based on a very weak databases, and by itself is not sufficient to argue for a climatic framework of this migration. Similar simplifying scenarios have been proposed for the Byzantine Empire, or the Roman Empire as it perceived itself, which was at the peak of its power in the medieval period in the early 11th century, at the end of the reign of Emperor Basil II in 1025. And you see the map that it ranged from the Danube all the way to the modern-day borders between Turkey and Iran. And you see also 60 years later, a very different scenario where Byzantium, the capital Constantinople, has lost its control over Asia Minor, over modern-day Turkey. And we can also measure this, the amount of rebellions and the reduction of territory. And again, at a first glance, one could argue that this can be correlated with an increasing number of climatic extreme events. If you look at these maps for the 2 half centuries of the 11th century, we have quite a number of events, especially reported for the area around the capital of Constantinople. And these references to these extreme events in the historiography of the time have also been counted. You see here at the bottom that we also have a peak in the number of references to such calamities in the written sources. And in addition, we can also augment the information from the Byzantine Greek sources, for instance, on a famine in 1032, with sources from adjacent regions. So for instance, in Syriac or in Arabic, which allows us to triangulate the actual extent of this famine, which also covered much larger areas in the adjacent regions. And if we do this, we find quite a big amount of extreme events, climate anomalies, and also epidemics between the 1020s and the 1050s. So this seems to support the scenario again of Ellen Bloom that climate change very much led to the destabilization of the Byzantine Empire. However, we have to be aware that the descriptions of these natural phenomena in these written sources are not just data like a weather report of today, but they were used as narrative instruments. They were used as devices for specific purposes in the narratives of these historians, especially as portents, as signs suggesting, for instance, the fate of an elite, the fate of a ruler, or as Mark Elvin has originally identified for the Chinese case, but this can be applied for all the cultures across Afro-Eurasia and also beyond, that these weather phenomena were also used in the written sources as indications of the divine evaluation of the morals, of the moral qualities of a ruler, of the elite, of the society at large, what Elvin has called the moral meteorology. So the events in the sky, climate events, but also other portents like astrological events, could be interpreted as indicators how the divine power, however it may have been identified, evaluated the moral quality of a ruler or of a society at large. So this, of course, could be used by historians, the frequency and the quality of such events, to also communicate their opinion on specific rulers. And this we find very much in these periods for the Byzantine Empire between the 1020s and the 1050s. We find this in a positive way, so that historians try to create a positive image of an emperor, like Emperor Romanos III, who is depicted as a very able crisis manager, who is also able to confine internal migration, which happened in Asia Minor due to famine and pestilence. In this famine we already have mentioned in the early 1030s. And he is also lauded, praised for other measures against the crisis, like building aqueducts or restoring the leper house in Constantinople. So he is an able crisis manager. But at the end of his reign, he is killed. He is murdered. At least this is the narrative which the historian John Skilitzes, on whom we rely here, is drawing in his chronicle. And we also have an illustrated version of this chronicle, which is now preserved in the National Library in Madrid, the Skilitzes Madridensis. And from this very, very lavishly illustrated manuscripts, they also have these images where you see to the right the assassination of Romanos III. And this assassination is attributed to the following regime of the emperors Michael IV and Michael V, and their brother, respectively uncle, John, called the Orphanotrophos. And this regime, these are now the bad guys in the history of John Skilitzes, and their reign is even more full of such portents and calamities. So the frequency of these calamities is not an objective fact. It is also a reflection of the opinion of this historian about the specific reign. And the higher frequency of calamities is also an indicator of what his opinion is, of how, in his opinion, the divine power evaluated this reign. And this becomes clear throughout the history, both regarding the individuals as such, like Michael IV, affected by a disease, but also the empire at large. Nevertheless, in some sentences, even John Skilitzes has to indicate that actually this regime was not that bad, that they were also at sometimes able crisis manager, for instance, providing grain from other provinces when there was a lack of food in Constantinople. But nevertheless, it's very clear, and John Skilitzes is very explicit about this, that all these portents indicated God's anger, God's wrath about this reign, and that they also presage the forthcoming catastrophe for the tyrants, because ultimately this regime comes to an end in a rebellion, and Michael V and John Orphanotrophos are blinded, so they lose their eyesight, as we can see in these drawings. So we have to be aware that the frequency of these calamities, and also the calamities as they are described, they are not objective weather reports. They serve a specific purpose in the narrative. What we also can observe then, when the crisis of Byzantium in the 1060s and 1070s, which is around the main defeat against the Seljuks in the Battle of Manzikert in what is now Eastern Turkey in 1071, when we have the peak of this crisis, we also have portents, but they are mostly of a non-climatic kind. So we have no climatic calamities in this period. The other portents, such as the sightings of Halley's Comet, which is also observed at that time in other parts of Europe, and you even find it drawn in the famous tapestry of Bayeux, which shows the Norman conquest of England. And the sighting of the comet is one in a long list of portents, which then culminates in this big crisis of the 1070s. But as I said, if one looks at these descriptions, climate change, climatic fluctuations don't play a role at all. It is again mainly human action or inactivity. So for instance, one of the following regimes then is by another historian described as being totally inactive in the face of the crisis. When refugees from Asia Minor came to Constantinople, when there was a lack of foodstuff, they remained inactive. They did not supply the refugees as Romanov III did decades before. And in addition, they aggravated the situation by establishing a grain trade monopoly in the city of Raidestos to the west of Constantinople, which was one of the main grain markets for the capital, in order to have an additional tax income. This, however, led to a reduction of the inflow of grain to Constantinople. So grain was in short supply and abundance turned into dearth, as we read in the source. The people's discontent increased, so it was again a socio-political measure which led to famine in Constantinople and was not related to any climatic calamity. Along similar lines, what we could observe in the Egyptian case. So if we look again in detail on the Byzantine sources, we see first that the description and the frequency of these calamities is not just sheer data, it's a narrative device. And if we look in detail at the peak of the crisis, it's again this interplay between some environmental factors, but especially also inner socio-economic mechanisms. Of course, in addition, we have then the external effect of the migration or the invasions of various nomadic neighbors, also from the Normans in southern Egypt, but especially nomadic groups like the Pechenegs from modern-day Ukraine and the Seljuks from modern-day Iran and Iraq. Originating, the Seljuks originally were a dynasty group of the so-called Oghuz Turks originating in Asia Minor, and from the 1040s onwards they migrated to the Middle East. And this has also been connected by Ronnie Ellenblum and before him by Richard Bulliet, the United States American historian, with again climatic calamities in Central Asia. They argued that especially cold conditions more or less forced these groups to migrate towards the Middle East, the Islamic world, and towards Byzantium. And they do this on the basis again of very few natural scientific data. So there's this one. There are some data which indicate that there were cold conditions in some areas of Central Asia, like this data set based on tree rings from Kyrgyzstan, or this data set which Richard Bulliet, who had created a similar scenario 3 years ahead of the study of Ronnie Ellenblum in 2009, he used only one data set in his book, and this comes from Mongolia, so very far away from where the Oghuz Turks originated, which would be in modern-day Western Kazakhstan, so thousands of kilometers away. So the problem is, for this scenario is based on very few proxy data from a region which is vast. Central Asia is vast with high regional differences. So one cannot use just one data set and say this is then representative of entire Central Asia. And in addition, this scenario that it was primarily these cold climate anomalies which forced the Seljuks to migrate was also rejected independently by 3 specialists on the region, again on the basis of written sources. Jürgen Paul, Deborah Thor, and Joshua Franklin independently published papers all were able to show on a detailed reading of written evidence that there is no indication that it was climatic factors which forced the migration of the Seljuks to these regions. So again, we see, and this is work of others I'm only referring to, that again, a detailed examination of the evidence draws a much more complex image. Along similar lines, then Ronnie Ellenblum, who unfortunately passed away 2 years ago, in one of his last papers also tried to show that this idea that primarily climatic factors were responsible for the rise and fall of empires in this region, that it would also work for East Asia. And he wrote with two colleagues a paper on the Khitan Liao Empire, which was established in the 10th century by the people called the Khitan, who then in Chinese terms called themselves the Liao, and they established an empire in what is now modern-day northeastern People's Republic of China, modern-day Mongolia, and parts of northern China, all the way to the modern Beijing. So this was the area ruled by the Khitan Liao. They have found their main opponents to the south in the Chinese Song dynasty, who ruled the rest of China. And the Song dynasty is normally connected to a period of enormous economic and demographic growth, which can also be demonstrated on the basis of text lists, which show a big increase of population across the 11th century in China, and even one type of first industrial revolution, as it has been called, because we also find a big amount of exploitation of coal, of steel production, so an early industrialization, one could say. What we, however, also can see at the time on the basis of proxy data, that also the same climatic turbulences which we observe in Western Eurasia, we can also observe for Eastern Asia. And this then eventually led to a very interesting combination of socioeconomic growth and intensification of the use of the landscape, but then also the effect of these climatic turbulences, but again, along much more complex lines than a simple linear correlation. The capital of the Song dynasty was established in the city of Kaifeng near the Yellow River, and was provisioned via a very complex canal network, with the main canal or river being the Bian, and hundreds of thousands of tons of grain had to be, rice and other foodstuff were transported in the city in order to provide for a population of maybe 1 million inhabitants. We also have a very illustrative image of the life along this canal in this painting called By the River during the King Ming Festival, which shows a fascinating image of the city, but also of the provision of the city. For instance, the grain cargo vessels, which were, some of them were massive, which brought foodstuff to the city. But in order to maintain this canal network, an immense amount of investment of manpower and of resources were necessary. And this is true throughout Chinese history. These are images from the 19th and 20th century from the area of Kaifeng, but we can imagine similar scenarios for the 11th century. Especially demanding was to keep these canals operational because of the silting. Regularly, they had to be dredged. And the silting of the canal and of the Yellow River as such was an effect of the increase of demography, of economy, and of the intensification of land use. The intensification of land use along the Yellow River increased the amount of erosion and the sedimentary load in the Yellow River. The Yellow River originally got its name from the sediments, these yellow colored sediments, which gave it its color and give its color to the Yellow River. Until today, you see a modern satellite image. And what we can observe is, with this increase of land use, this increase of erosion, also the risk of dam breaches, of flood catastrophes increased. So this was a direct effect of human action, of human impact on the ecology. And on top of this, we now have this increase of climatic fluctuations during the odd minimum in the 11th century, which also can be reconstructed on the basis of proxy data. And you see another map here for East Asia. We also see teleconnections like the El Nino Thousand Oscillation, which connects all these regions from East Africa via East Asia all the way to the Americas. What we can see then during some of the periods of the odd minimum is an increase in the number of extreme precipitation events. And this now on top of the increase of the risk of flooding due to the increased sedimentary load led to some of the most catastrophic floodings of the Yellow River in its entire history. And we also see an increase in the frequency of these floodings throughout the 11th century. And I refer to these two great books by Zhang of 2016 and of Ruth Mostyn of 2021, who also synthesized this finding in a very impressive and new way. The most catastrophic shift of the lower Yellow River occurred in 1048, where the lower river changed its main course over more than 200 kilometers, and then especially affected one region in the northeast of the Sung Chinese Empire, the Hebei province, which was largely devastated by this flood. However, again, the devastation of Hebei was not only the effect of this natural catastrophe. This region was at the border between the Song dynasty and the competing empire of the Liao Khitan, which I have mentioned. And in order to defend Kaifeng, the capital, the Song had created artificial lakes in this region and a dam system, which then in the case of an attack of the Khitan Liao would be opened. So the dikes would be opened to create an artificial floodplain to reduce the advance of the very mobile Khitan Liao army as it happened during an invasion in 1004, 1005. So more or less the province was flooded in order to defend the capital. And of course, the province, to a certain extent, never recovered from these man-made floodings. And on top of these, we now have these natural catastrophes. This, of course, reminds of later floodings of the Yellow River in 1938. Also, the dams were opened to create an artificial floodplain to stop the Japanese army at that time attacking China in this war, also creating a huge human catastrophe with tens of thousands of people dead and millions of refugees. And we can imagine a similar scale of catastrophe for the 11th century. After this flooding of 1048, the Sung government for some time with very high investment tried to redivert the Yellow River from the Hebei province. However, when again there was the danger in 1070, 1078 that the capital as such would be flooded, the decision was easy. Again, the dams were opened at the north side of the Yellow River, and again the province of Hebei was flooded in order to save the capital. And we read on these occasions that this led to tens of thousands of refugees flying to the south of the river. So also internal migration connected to this catastrophe. Again, there is the natural impact of this flooding after extreme precipitation events, but the outcome, who is affected in the end, is based on the decision making of the government. And again, the capital, the imperial residence, is privileged over the interests of an adjacent region. Ultimately, this led to a collapse of the border defenses, this constant also devastation of the border region, and ultimately the Song lost this region to another nomadic people from the north, the Jin, who then conquered Kaifeng in 1127. And around the same time, we also see another major flooding, and the lower course of the Yellow River was relocated over hundreds of kilometers to the south. Again, in a combination of natural event, but also again human action and human contribution to these dynamics. So, what I hope that I was able to show in these three case studies is that this odd minimum of the 11th century provides us with an interesting opportunity to compare these polities, these very different configurations of power with regard to their reaction to similar climatic extremes. What Lieberman has called in his books somehow strange parallels. What we also can see that these are not necessarily societies in decline or in crisis per se, as it is described in these books I have referred to. Actually, what we see both in China but also in Byzantium on the basis of pollen data, these are societies in a period of growth in terms of demography, of agricultural activity, so affluent societies. But what we can see are also crisis phenomena emerging from this growth, both in terms of socioeconomic inequality and political crisis and political competition, but also the effects on the ecology, especially in the Chinese case, when the effects of socioeconomic growth that increase the risk of floodings in the Yellow River, which then is aggravated in addition by the climatic fluctuations. And this, I think, is also maybe, or I hope that this is that this also indicates how delicate or how complex this interplay between environmental climatic factors and socioeconomic dynamics is. What we often see in studies is that not only the natural scientific data is aggregated in big data sets, but also the historical data is aggregated in quantitative lists of frequencies of natural phenomena or frequencies of rebellions. And with this aggregation, the individual characters of each of these events disappear, and then simple correlations are drawn, linear correlations, frequency of crisis, socioeconomic crisis, and frequency of climatic events, for instance, resulting then also in simplifying headlines in newspapers that, for instance, major volcanic eruptions caused Chinese dynasties to collapse. To make such a claim, for instance, for the Song dynasty, about which we have just talked, would be so much reducing the actual complexity of what is happening in a way which is totally unhelpful for historians. We are interested in the peculiarities of these configurations and constellations, and it's not simply sufficient to say there's the one event and this is always the same outcome. This is simply not the case. So we have to deal with a multitude of natural proxies, also indicating high regional diversity, a diversity of regional dynamics, both in terms of ecologies, climatic parameters, but also regional frameworks of land use. And we also have, of course, the complexity of our narratives, of which we as historians, of course, are aware all the time. So we would never reduce them to simples, ones or zeros, binary, if there's event or not, because we are aware also of the narrative strategies of our authors, for instance. So all this also has motivated various colleagues working in climate history to demand a more sophisticated history of climate and society, which does justice to all these complexities of sources and avoids simplifying scenarios. And I'm referring to this great paper by Dagmar de Groot and his colleagues published in 2021 in Nature. And you find also the link, it's open access, so you can read it. And we really would recommend that you have a look at it if you're interested in environmental history. And finally, I would also like to refer a forthcoming publication I have the honor to edit, a special issue of the journal De Medioevo, published in Spain, which will be connected to what I have also described in the framework of moral meteorologies, where we will have a collection of papers, various case studies across the globe and across very widely the medieval period from late antiquity actually until the 16th, 17th century, trying also again to indicating how various societies then used such phenomena as portents or as signs and interpret them within the cultural and political matrices. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Johannes Preiser-Kapeller, for this brilliant conference in which you have illustrated as a very complex factors in many different parts of the world at the same time, simultaneously, and in which you have illustrated us in the relationship between, well, the causal relationship between climate and social transformation. I will only switch to Spanish for a small while to be able to get some ideas, of course, our audience. Bien, entonces el doctor Preiser-Kapeller fundamentalmente nos trae una conferencia que pone en cuestión la relación causal, unilateral o unidimensional entre fenómenos climatológicos y transformaciones sociales y económicas, así como demográficas, movilización de personas en diferentes partes del mundo, para lo cual nos ofrece tres grandes ejemplos: el primero del imperio fatimita, el segundo del mundo bizantino y el tercero del mundo chino en el siglo XI, es decir, en un tiempo relativamente cercano los unos con los otros, demostrando en todos los casos que no existe una relación lineal y unicausal entre fenómenos climatológicos y transformaciones históricas y sociales, sino que es necesario tomar en cuenta una multiplicidad de factores, entre los cuales se encuentran, por supuesto, la agencia humana en múltiples situaciones que tienen una relación dialógica con ese tipo de transformaciones climatológicas que se están dando. De forma tal que no puede reducirse o simplificarse una transformación social de gran escala o de pequeña escala a una situación puramente climatológica. Thank you again very much, Professor Johannes Preiser-Kapeller. We have several questions which our faculty have prepared beforehand. So, and deal mostly with methodological aspects of your work. So we will start with those questions, and then we will go to any questions that might come up spontaneously, either in YouTube or via Zoom. I will switch back from Spanish to English to be able to serve both our professor and the audience. Le digo entonces al profesor Johannes Preiser-Kapeller que tenemos varias preguntas que han sido preparadas previamente por miembros de nuestra unidad académica y que serán expuestas. Yo las leeré primero en inglés y enseguida las leeré en español con el fin de tener tanto la pregunta como la respuesta en ambos idiomas. Bien, entonces, I will start with the first question. Undoubtedly, your studies are compromised with the global perspective of historical analysis. Your endeavors always go beyond the traditional center of things, for instance, Europe after the 2nd century BC or the Near East before that. Do you ever find it difficult to leave behind the center-periphery model?
What I encounter in my studies is very much that you can always shift the center and the periphery. So one of my earliest approaches towards getting more global was to shift from Constantinople to the Caucasus region, which was from the perspective of Constantinople the eastern periphery, but of course has its own very rich historiography, which very much makes it unique, especially in the early medieval period, and provides an alternative view on the empires on its peripheries, both on the Byzantine Roman Empire, but also on the Sasanian Persian Empire, or later on the Arab Caliphate, and provides a unique perspective from what is a periphery from the point of view of the centers of these empires, but in the end is a central periphery. And this is, I think, is always not only provides new perspectives on the so-called centers, but also forces us to rethink about what is actually the center, what is the periphery, and to what extent also the imperial centers depended on the peripheries, because they were a big source of military manpower, for instance, or of other skills. So I guess that it was never a big challenge to shift away from this pattern, but a big chance to get more insights. Yeah.
Thank you. Bueno, siempre voy a ofrecer una respuesta un poco resumida de lo que el profesor está respondiendo, pues es bastante difícil seguir la traducción de manera literal. La pregunta es la siguiente que yo le hago al profesor. Le digo que indudablemente sus estudios han estado comprometidos con una perspectiva global del análisis histórico y siempre han demostrado el hecho de, o el intento de salirse del centro tradicional de las cosas. Por ejemplo, Europa después del siglo II antes de Cristo o el Próximo Oriente antes de eso. Le pregunto si en algún momento encontró una dificultad saliéndose del paradigma tradicional de centro-periferia. La respuesta del profesor es que más bien eso significó una oportunidad para abandonar la idea del centro, porque en una perspectiva analítica, el centro siempre podía cambiarse. Llevar el centro, por ejemplo, trasladarlo desde Bizancio hacia el Cáucaso, transformaba completamente el análisis, las perspectivas que se podían tener del mismo Bizancio. Es decir, que todo era un problema de enfoque. Entonces, en realidad, nunca se transformó en nunca fue una dificultad, sino más bien fue una oportunidad de dar dar esa transformación de enfoque para sacar el centro de lo que tradicionalmente se consideraba y desde esos lugares que antes pues, se consideraban periferia, poder dar una mirada a lo que antes se consideraba el centro, de manera tal que había una reformulación epistemológica. Thank you for this very interesting answer. Very well. Another question is, would you say you owe anything, methodologically speaking, to Fernand Braudel?
Of course. I think all of us do. And also for if because of course Byzantine studies is located in the Mediterranean, so Braudel's work on the Mediterranean in the age of Philip II, and then also his identification of these different layers of short-term, middle-term, long-term history, and also the continuities in Mediterranean interaction. These are of course is elementary basis for all further studies. Of course, when it comes to environmental history, what Braudel originally underestimated is the actual dynamics of environmental factors. Of course, this is also related to the amount of data which was accessible at his time, and he later also modified his views in this regard. But of course, to think in these terms is essential, and still that's how I would guess how one is also taught to think as a historian to a certain extent.
Thank you. Yo le pregunto al profesor Johannes Preiser-Kapeller que si puede identificar alguna influencia de Fernand Braudel en su trabajo. Me dice que por supuesto que sí, de varias maneras, empezando por el hecho de que el trabajo de Braudel sobre el Mediterráneo y el mundo mediterráneo en los tiempos de Felipe II lidia directamente con el mundo mediterráneo en donde se encuentra Bizancio, que es la especialidad del profesor. Además que hay una importante influencia de lo que son las diferentes capas de duración, la duración corta, mediana, larga. Y al mismo tiempo nos refiere al hecho de que, sin embargo, Braudel sí puede haber subestimado el impacto de los factores ambientales en sus análisis, que sin embargo eso podía deberse también a la disponibilidad de datos que existían en ese momento. Very well. A third question then says, your analysis always includes the use of mathematical models. However, you are clearly opposed to monocausal or simplistic explanations. Your demographic models make critical use of Malthus and Tolkien. Your economical models make equally critical use of Schumpeter, and they clearly deny the theories of rational choice. How do you deal methodologically with the use of models and the opposition to simplification?
Mm-hmm. I guess what these models can provide are ideas, possible, mechanisms, possible combinations of factors we may think about, and may try to identify also in our sources or find data which may support such correlations. But of course, they are always simplifications and abstractions. They cannot be used as the all-explaining instrument, and so it's more kind of using this as tools to reflect upon an approach towards sources, towards evidence, and less than using them really to explain mechanisms in this very strict way some of these equation systems demand. However, I'm also very much dealing with historical network research, and there it's a little bit different because the networks which emerge from the combination of the evidence you have in the sources. So this is not top down that you have an equation system, a theory, and then you try to find evidence, but these patterns, a network of Byzantine elites, for instance, they emerge from the information which is already in historical sources. So here you have a bottom-up dynamics, and this I think is more akin also to the dynamics we observe in our sources, where changes emerge from the sums of interactions of different players, and there, for instance, network models are more adequate, or in my view, are more adequate to use as tools than often some of these more simplifying big theories and equation systems.
Yes, thank you. Bien, yo le pregunto al doctor cuál es si encuentra alguna diferencia o alguna dificultad en maridar el uso de modelos matemáticos y una clara oposición a explicaciones simplistas o monocausales, tal como nos lo ha mostrado en esta conferencia, en donde hay una oposición a la monocausalidad o a la unilateralidad de las explicaciones. El profesor nos ofrece la siguiente respuesta. Dice que los modelos siempre constituyen ideas, siempre son abstracciones de factores que permiten, sin embargo, crear correlaciones y pensar problemas, pero siempre implican una simplificación. No son, por lo tanto, elementos que sean totalmente explicativos o explicativos de una totalidad. Sin embargo, sí diferencia la creación de sistemas climatológicos, demográficos, económicos con la realización de modelos de redes sociales, porque esos modelos más bien surgen de las diferentes fuentes que se encuentran, de la construcción de esas diferentes fuentes de la información ahí dispuesta y de un análisis complejo de las mismas, que bien produce un modelo simplificado al final, quizá en un dibujo, como puede mostrarse gráficamente, pero que implica en el proceso más bien una complejización, un cruce de variables, y por lo tanto no es efecto de una simplificación monocausal, como los otros sí lo son. Very well, we're arriving to the last two questions. So theories on complex systems have been awarded top academic recognition recently, given that in 2021, Srinkaro Manabe, Klaus Hasselmann, and Giorgio Parisi were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for their studies made in these fields. How has the mathematical study of complex systems influenced your work?
This very much connects to the earlier question. I was very much impressed by the application of mathematical models on social dynamics, what is called socio-physics, and which has emerged widely over the last 10-15 years, also again connected to network analysis. And of course, I think there are two aspects. The one is really using complexity theory in its full mathematical frameworks, also trying to apply mathematical methods on historical data. And I've tried to do this to a certain extent, again, with regarding to network analysis, but also to other factors. And the other aspect is to use complexity theory more as a metaphorical framework. So to borrow terms like the idea of that small changes can then have big impacts in chaotic systems, or there are system changes. There are rooms of possibilities between which systems can change, and that especially these periods of change where new possibilities are thinkable in a system, a socio-political system, that these are of specific interest. So these these ideas can also be used without any reference to mathematical models or quantitative data, and can also be very inspiring. And I found both aspects very useful. Of course, also being aware that there are limits what we can do on the basis of data which we have, and that we have to be careful that sometimes our colleagues from mathematics or physics, when they try to use historical data on their own, do not do justice to the complexity of this of these evidence, as I have also demonstrated for paleoenvironmental studies, because it's not just data like the measurement of a specific indicator of a natural phenomenon, but these are highly complex cultural matrices. So I think what is important is a cooperation between natural sciences, between mathematics and humanities and historians at an eye level, so that we are aware of each other's potential of the evidence, but also of its limits, and communicate it to each other clearly.
Thank you. Yo le pregunto al doctor sobre la relación que tiene su metodología con los sistemas complejos, dado que en el 2021 se le otorga el premio Nobel a Suñaro Manabe, Klaus Hasselmann y Giorgio Parisi por sus estudios en sistemas complejos. Y él me responde que lo ve de dos aspectos diferentes. Primero es el uso de modelos matemáticos multicausales en el análisis de las realidades históricas. Pero en el segundo también es más bien una forma metafórica de analizarlo, es decir, entendiendo que existen periodos específicos en los que se puede poner a dialogar una multiplicidad de causas sociales, climatológicas, demográficas, etcétera, con el fin de ofrecer explicaciones a fenómenos históricos. Entendiendo, sin embargo, que hay límites en los datos que tenemos disponibles para poder llevar a cabo ese tipo de análisis cruzados. Ante lo cual, sí establece una crítica a cuando matemáticos puros o físicos puros, otros científicos intentan sobresimplificar la realidad histórica con el fin de ofrecer modelos matemáticos que expliquen de manera simplista esas realidades sociales complejas. Very well. The last question I have there is, lately you published a paper explaining how AI could assist in the analysis of complex historical systems and problems. What new perspectives could such an analysis offer? And do you think this will be attainable in short term?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, this were some interviews I gave to various magazines. So in my work on historical networks, I also experimented with tools based on artificial intelligence, which would, for instance, automatically not only extract information from sources, but also combine them in networks, for instance, also interpret the sources. And there the limits became clear, because these tools are not yet able really to identify the exact context. They mix connections of very different kinds, so the limitations become clear. So they cannot do the work of an historian who has an intimate knowledge of her or his sources and has read them and knows the context and the peculiarities. However, where we see big progress are less these one big centralized systems, but projects like Transcribus, which is a platform which evolved in Austria at the University of Innsbruck, and which allows historians to train the individual artificial intelligences on the basis of documents they have already deciphered, to read these documents. And this network, which is non-profit oriented, is now a network of tens of thousands of historians, and also of tens of thousands of individual artificial intelligences, in the plural, which are then more or less trained for a specific amount of documents by the specialists. And thereby you create a very transparent system, so you know how it works. It's perfectly fitted to a specific task, and then can be a very useful instrument. And there I see a lot of potential, because it's also a democratic form of the use of artificial intelligence. It's not controlled by big companies, and where there are black boxes and you don't really know the algorithms, the networks of learning behind the artificial intelligences. And this is a counter model which at the same time has provided so far the most convincing results in the application of artificial intelligence, especially also in medieval history.
Es fácil. Bien, yo le pregunto al doctor sobre que hace poco tiempo publicó una serie de entrevistas sobre el uso de la inteligencia artificial en el análisis histórico. Y nos dice primero que en ese momento está ampliamente limitado porque no tiene un conocimiento íntimo de las fuentes ni de los análisis que se han venido haciendo sobre esas fuentes. Por lo tanto, si se pregunta de manera superficial a la inteligencia artificial, usualmente confundirá relaciones, confundirá fuentes y otorgará resultados que no son muy valiosos. Sin embargo, menciona un punto tremendamente importante, que es el hecho de que si existe una plataforma que se llama Transcribus, que fue desarrollada en la Universidad de Innsbruck en Viena, y consiste en lo siguiente: son, bueno, aparentemente decenas de miles de historiadores que están entrenando individualmente decenas de miles de agentes de inteligencia artificial, enseñándoles a analizar los documentos que ya ellos han descifrado y analizado de manera anterior. De manera tal que se están estableciendo un sistema de aprendizaje, como de pupilaje individual de estos diferentes agentes de inteligencia artificial, y de manera democrática, de manera transparente, utilizando open source y permitiendo a los demás historiadores conocer los análisis que se están haciendo, las formas de aprendizaje y de captura de esa nueva información, de manera tal que se puedan cruzar estas informaciones. No le pertenecen a una gran compañía, no están ocultas las formas algorítmicas de relación, sino que se está haciendo de manera democrática. Very well. I see that we have arrived at the end of this conference. In the chat, you might find, which we will put in YouTube, several comments that your professor has given us for his references. Entonces, en el chat, y luego lo vamos a poner en los comentarios de YouTube, encontramos varios vínculos de referencia, tanto a los diferentes diapositivas de la presentación que el doctor nos ofreció hoy, como a la referencia de este último programa Transcribus, que se encuentra también y que podemos visitar, que me parece tremendamente fácil. Professor, thank you so much for this brilliant conference, for this extremely informative, entertaining, insightful talk that you have given us. Has become and will be very profitable for anyone who has attended or anyone who will be able to watch a recording in the YouTube channel of the Master's program. In the name of these Masters, in the name of our university, thank you so much for having joined us in this morning for us and this afternoon for you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this invitation and for the opportunity to present some of my research. And many thanks for the great questions and the discussion. I very much enjoyed it. And of course, if anyone has any question or would like to know more about specific project I've mentioned, everyone can also write an email to me and I can send you the links. So I would be very happy to do so. And it was really a great pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Venimos entonces al final de esta conferencia, a la conclusión. El profesor ofrece, quien quiera le puede escribir, luego compartiremos su dirección de correo electrónico. Nazaret, creo que podemos parar la grabación y la transmisión en vivo. Muchas gracias.